July 13, 1942. A unit of 500 German soldiers, the 101st Police Reserve Battalion, arrives in the town of Józefów, located in east-central Poland, with the mission of eradicating the Jews living there. These are 1,500 people who, by express orders from the leaders of the Third Reich, must be eliminated immediately. They should not show mercy to anyone, not even women, children, or the elderly. However, there is a catch. None of these men have killed anyone before. For them, taking a life is something new. Third Troop Commander, Major Wilhelm Trapp, knows that the Germans are inexperienced, so he offers them the opportunity not to participate in the massacre. He meets with them and tells them that, if they do not want to become murderers, all they have to do is take a step forward, and they will be exempt from this aberrant task. What happened next is one of the most surprising events of World War II and relates to the Germans' motives for killing. Did they do it for pleasure? Or on the contrary, because they felt they had no alternative? Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you what the Nazis felt when annihilating their enemies. To understand this history, we have to go back to the origins of Nazi hatred. The National Socialist Party had the firm conviction that the human species was divided into races. According to this theory, each of them had particular characteristics that had been transmitted hereditarily for thousands of years. This meant that they had a distinctive physical appearance, but also a certain culture, way of thinking, and intelligence. On the other hand, not all races were equal to each other, but rather they were organized between the inferior and the superior. This scientific theory established that some possessed genetic attributes that made them suitable to lead humanity, while the rest were destined to submit. Nazism also adopted the idea of survival of the fittest, meaning that, in order not to perish, a race had to multiply and accumulate land to support that growing population. As physical space was somewhat limited, to acquire new territories, it was necessary to destroy the inferior peoples. Of course, the Führer's followers thought that the Germans were the Aryan race that should conquer Europe. Let's see David Silberklang, a specialist in this matter, explain this to us.
At its core, the Nazi worldview was racist and biological, positing that the so-called Aryan race, primarily the North Europeans, was the superior race of human beings to which nearly all positive human development in science, technology, art, architecture, and other fields could be attributed.
Among those who were to be exterminated were Jews, people of African descent, and Slavs. It is not known with certainty how Hitler embraced these theories of hatred or the reasons for his intense anti-Semitism. There are those who claim that the Nazi leader had a venereal disease that had been contracted by a Jewish prostitute. Others maintain that he was ashamed of having a distant Semitic ancestor. None of this is verifiable, but what we do know is that the social and political context of the 1920s was perfect for the darkest feelings of the German population to emerge. The Germans were defeated in World War I, and at the end of the war, a good part of the country embraced the stab in the back theory. According to her, the culprits of the war's failure had been the Jews, who conspired to make the nation surrender just when it was about to triumph. Hitler was one of the many who accepted these postulates as valid, and from then on, he began an impressive political career that catapulted him to the top of the German government. Once he was in command of the Third Reich, he dedicated himself to implementing its perverse racial policy. For the Führer, it was necessary to maintain the purity of the Aryans, which meant that the Germans did not have to mix with members of the inferior races. The only way to strengthen the people was to preserve their blood clean and free of deficient genes. To achieve this, blacks, Jews, and Slavs were progressively separated from the rest of society to the point where they were isolated in concentration camps. During World War II, the Nazis launched their extermination plans and dedicated themselves to annihilating all those people they saw as subhuman. The descriptions of the massacres are chilling and show the bloodlust that Germany's troops harbored. Take the example of the Babi Yar massacre, which occurred between September 29 and 30, 1941. This episode occurred when the German occupation forces in Ukraine decided to get rid of the Jews from the country's capital. To do this, they were summoned by the following statement: all Jews living in the city of Kiev and its surroundings must appear at 8 in the morning at the corner of Melnikovskaya and Doktorov streets near the cemetery. They must carry with them their documents, money, valuables, as well as warm clothing, bedding, etc. Any Jew who does not comply with this instruction and is found elsewhere will be executed. Citizens who enter the abandoned apartments of the Semites and seize their property will be shot. They were strict words that left no room for any alternative. One had to obey or die. The day after the publication of the message, some 30,000 Jewish men, women, and children showed up at the indicated place, thinking that they would be deported to some distant concentration camp. They were not aware that they were terribly wrong and that the worst of fates awaited them. The Germans took them on foot to the Babi Yar ravine, located on the outskirts of the city, where they made them strip naked and lie face down. While they were lying down, the soldiers drew their pistols and machine guns and began shooting at them at point-blank range. The victims who arrived last at the site were forced to lie on top of the corpses to save space and were murdered just as coldly. Let's see a survivor of the day tell us what she remembers.
Первым упал папа, а я видела, как папа упал и потянул маму с собой. Потом сестры, а потом я уже не помню. Я не помню, я только пришла в себя тогда, когда была ночь, и было холодно очень. И я от холода пришла в себя, на мне была тяжесть. Тяжесть большая. Я вернуться не могла, тяжесть трупа на мне лежала.
Another witness to the massacre remembers it in the following way. Plus, she could not flee. The blows were brutal. Blood flowed immediately from the heads, backs, and shoulders to the left and to the right. There was no escape. The soldiers shouted, "Quick, quick," and laughed with amusement as if they were watching a circus show. They had even found a way to hit harder in the most vulnerable places: the ribs, stomach, and groin. It is estimated that almost all the Jews who attended the meeting were executed during that day, making it one of the bloodiest during the occupation of Ukraine. When analyzing the statements and testimonies about this carnage, one of the most notable points is how much fun the Nazis felt when killing their enemies. When faced with the suffering of others, his reaction was not to pity or cry, but to celebrate, make jokes, and laugh. In general, all the massacres in which members of the National Socialist Party participated developed in a similar way to this one. The behavior of the Germans can be explained first of all by the success that the racist ideology of the Third Reich had. In any corner of the Nazi Empire, the regime's official propaganda could be found, which promoted hatred towards inferior peoples. After years of installing in society that these people were dangerous for the Aryan race, a good part of the Germans ended up accepting it as an unquestionable truth. They were convinced that they were superior, that they were called to dominate the planet, and that others should be, at best, their servants. Therefore, it is possible that by murdering a supposedly inferior person, whose life was worth the same as that of an insect, they felt the pleasure of doing the world a favor. It is known that the Nazis accompanied mass murders with relaxing music, in order to liven up the moment and make it more satisfying. In the Auschwitz extermination center, it was common for SS guards to enter the barracks where the prisoners lived drunk and without prior notice during the night. They harassed the inmates and asked those who had knowledge of music to play an instrument. If the inmates refused, they were savagely beaten or, worse still, shot on the spot. While some happy melody was playing, the Germans began to rape the youngest women in the barracks. Something equally macabre was happening in the Belzec concentration camp. The Nazis organized an orchestra made up of prisoners to play while they murdered people in the gas chambers. The cries of the victims were drowned out by the notes sung by the violins, guitars, double basses, and cellos. Sometimes music was used during massacres, as happened on November 3, 1943, when 18,000 Jews were executed at the Majdanek extermination center. That dark day began at 5 in the morning. When the inmates were taken to a trench on the outskirts of the site, they were made to go down into some wells in groups of 10 and shot in the back of the head. The process continued until the afternoon, when the ground was covered by a mountain of corpses. As the air was filled with the sound of gunshots and the screams of the dying, the soldiers turned on the truck's speakers and played music. Thus, the massacre was harmonized with waltzes, tangos, military marches, and German folk songs. These examples are enough to affirm that there were Nazis who genuinely enjoyed their task and who couldn't wait to open fire on defenseless prisoners. Hitler's racist preaching had turned them into soulless monsters who blindly obeyed the commands of the hierarchs of the Third Reich. However, although sadism was quite widespread among the troops, it is not true that all Germans behaved in this way. There were those who killed, but they did not do it with pleasure. They hated the mission they had been given and were ashamed of themselves. Others, on the other hand, brandished their rifles indifferently and shot at their enemies without giving it much thought. They did not hate the inferior races, but they believed that they had to follow the orders of their superiors without question. So they killed without enthusiasm, but not with regret either. In this sense, let's look at one of the most striking cases of the Holocaust, that of the 101st Police Reserve Battalion. This unit was made up of men between 30 and 50 years old, people too old to be recruited as regular soldiers of the Wehrmacht. All of them were assigned to this group, which was used as second-line troops in the territories occupied by the Third Reich. They carried out deportation missions for non-Aryans. This involved evicting them from their homes and directing them to a train that would take them to a concentration camp. The battalion was made up of about 500 soldiers from Hamburg, a city where communism was strong and where the Nazis often lost elections, when Hitler's dictatorship had not yet begun. Let's listen to historian Christopher Browning tell us about the members of the unit.
They were mostly working class, which meant this was the class that in greater proportions voted for the communists and the socialists. The Nazis had less success in winning over working class people than other classes in society.
This meant that the members of the 101st were probably not convinced Nazis, but were there out of obligation. Even so, as we will see below, they did not hesitate when it came to committing a terrible crime. As we told you at the beginning of this video, on July 13, 1942, Battalion 101 was sent to eliminate 1,500 Jews in the town of Józefów in Poland. They had never killed anyone before. This would be their baptism of blood. The unit's commander, Major Wilhelm Trapp, offered his men the chance to stay out of the slaughter. All they had to do was take one step forward, and they would be excluded from the mission without punishment. The response of the troops was surprising. Of 500 soldiers, only 12 refused to be part of the massacre and the rest took up their weapons. They took the victims to a forest and separated them into groups. The Jews were shot in the back of the head, as was common in this type of execution. It was done this way because it was the simplest way and the one that finished people off immediately. With this totally dehumanized look, the fact of not wasting bullets was considered a triumph. The Germans followed the orders to the letter and ended up bathed in blood and splattered with pieces of bone and remains of gray matter. It was such a macabre scene that some asked to leave to take a break, drink alcohol, gather their strength, and then return to the massacre. By the end of the day, the Jewish population of Józefów had been exterminated. At the end of World War II, almost none of the battalion's members were convicted of their crimes. Only Major Wilhelm Trapp and 2 other junior officers were captured by the Allies and tried for war crimes. The court found them guilty and, in December 1948, sentenced them to death by hanging. Decades later, the surviving members of the battalion were interviewed by historian Christopher Browning, whom we heard from earlier. The former soldiers claimed they did not enjoy any of the killings. There were those who were ashamed of their actions. Others, however, justified themselves by saying that they were doing their job. When asked why they did not reject their commander's offer and refuse to be part of the massacre, they responded that they were simply afraid of being called cowards by their comrades. This means that, according to them, they did not kill out of anti-Semitism, nor out of loyalty to the Führer, but because they did not want others to think they were weak. Let us turn again to Professor Browning, who explains this in great detail.
And the pressures that are exerted in a small group, particularly an occupation unit in foreign territory, hostile territory in war, where they have no other support network, where peer pressure, role adaptation, deference to authority, all of these factors we know from other kinds of social psychological experiments shape people's behavior in groups in ways that they will do things they would never do as individuals.
In short, do the Nazis enjoy massacring their enemies, or did they do it because they had no alternative? We will never know. But as we have seen in this video, the Germans reacted in various ways to orders to eliminate their enemies, some with a smile on their lips, others with a mixture of rejection and shame. The truth is that most of the perpetrators of the Holocaust were not punished, leaving victims feeling that the injustice will never end. We reached the end of the video and we want to ask you, do you think the Nazis felt pleasure in killing their victims? Leave us your answer in the comments box below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history.